Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the podcast where we go over the last week's summaries and articles as covered by the Journal Feed. This week, those summaries were brought to you by our authors Joshua Belfer, Chris Thome, Shannon Marcus, Jason Lesnick, Amanda Matthews, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's skip straight to the third article, titled Outcomes of Older Adults with Delirium Discharged from the Emergency Department, out of the Annals of Emergency Medicine. This is good. I like to see research on delirium. I think it is really underappreciated just how bad of a marker it is that your patient gets delirium. If your patient has delirium, their risk of mortality over the next month to year is a lot higher. And this is interesting to look at because I don't know that I discharge very many patients with delirium. I often treat this as more of an indication for admission than anything else because it really comes with a very high mortality rate. Unless, of course, you're discharging to palliative care or, if they have a level of care that is not concordant with more interventions and they have the proper supports at home, that's a different story. Anyways, these authors had a site, a large academic center in Minnesota, where they did some screening by the nurses for delirium. And so thus they could have positive screening tests, yes or no, to see which of their patients had delirium. And they had almost 23,000 visits by adult patients over 75 years old, and they divided them into 4 groups. Delirium positive and discharged, delirium positive and admitted to the hospital, delirium negative and discharged, and delirium negative and admitted to the hospital. So you could compare all of these groups. And that's exactly what they did. So if you look at patients who have delirium who are discharged, they have a 3 times higher 30-day mortality than patients who do not have delirium and were discharged. A also similar increase of 150% for your rates of emergency department return. Not surprisingly, the group with the highest mortality were those with delirium and admitted to the hospital. I'm glad that they were admitted. But then really second place was delirium and discharge. So this delirium is really associated with a very high mortality rate. Not that this was happening very commonly. Only 3% of the cohort was discharged with delirium, so I'm glad to see that I'm not the only one who wants to admit these patients. Interestingly, they also did an analysis with dementia and found very similar results. Perhaps not too surprising because there is some correlation there. I think I'm going to continue my practice of being very wary of discharging anybody with delirium. In a spoonful, think twice before discharging someone with delirium. They have a 3-fold higher mortality rate, though, of course, it will depend on their level of care and where you're discharging them to. And then the fifth and final article, which was titled Randomized Control Trial of Mechanical Thrombectomy with Anticoagulation versus Anticoagulation Alone for Acute Intermediate to High Risk Pulmonary Embolism, the primary outcomes of the STORM-PE trial, out of the Journal of Circulation. Now, this is this is not exactly the trial I want to see. This is the kind of trial I want to see because people talk a lot about thrombectomy and catheter-directed thrombolysis, but there's not a lot of trials that actually compare them to the care which we already know to be appropriate for these patients. And so we have to do these comparison trials, otherwise we don't really know what we're doing. And that's why I can't really strongly recommend thrombectomy for any of these patients. This is similar to the Peerless study. However, Peerless compared to thrombectomy to catheter-directed thrombolysis, which is not what we want. We're just comparing two different modalities that we don't necessarily have any confidence in at all. And now we're actually comparing them to just anticoagulation, which is appropriate care for these patients. So this is the kind of trial that I want to see. All of these patients were put on low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin. I would have liked to see a sub-analysis for just the low molecular weight heparin group because, you get better anticoagulation with less bleeding events than using unfractionated heparin. So why use unfractionated heparin? Now, the primary outcome of this trial in hemodynamically stable patients with acute PEs was the difference in the RV to LV diameter on CTPA. They measured it when they first diagnosed the PE. Of course, that sounds pretty standard. And then 48 hours later. It's not a bad measurement, but it's not amazing either. Certainly not gold standard. Redoing the CTPA at 48 hours, that would not be a regular practice for you to do. And so I don't think that's the best measure here. It's not how I would want to have designed this trial. All the same, the thrombectomy group did show an improvement in this surrogate marker group of right ventricular strain, a difference of 0.27 for all that matters. I don't know how important that number is per se, but it was pretty much half of the ratio and was statistically significant. There is some correlation between right heart strain and mortality, but this is not a patient-centered outcome. There is no change in mortality here, and the authors do promise more patient-centered outcomes in another publication coming up, which I'd like to see. I'd love to see that. I wish you just published it all together. But for now, thrombectomy doesn't really seem to be proving itself. Also, they had a median thrombectomy time of 25 minutes. Wow, who moves that fast for a stable patient? That's insane. They had PERT teams on this. And so I don't know that this generalizes very well to other centers either. That's an amazing response time. Also of note is that the patients that did decompensate in the anticoagulation group, if they were unstable, then they crossed over to the thrombectomy group. So you can see at this center that there's definitely a bias towards thrombectomy. Even the one patient that they thrombolized also went to thrombectomy. There was not many bleeding events, and they were similar between the two groups. An outcome that I don't care about at all, really, but might be part of the reason why they did another CTPA, is that the measurements of the clot size and burden, of course, decreased with thrombectomy, but this is not an important outcome to me. I think it would have been easy for you to at least measure troponin normalization, BNP, markers like that. You could have reported on that, which would have been pretty easy to do as well, which is another easy marker of right heart strain to look at, but there's no reporting on that at all. So much potential as a really strong trial for this, but so many problems. This kind of just squeaks by as a technically positive trial, but not very good evidence to support the actual use of thrombectomy. Certainly not if you don't have it readily available already. I would not implement this in any sites based on this or recommend this as routine based on this. If you have easy availability of it, like this hospital seemed to, then sure, it doesn't seem to be doing any harm, and it seems to be doing some good. I think that less right heart strain is good, but it's not saving lives. In a spoonful, this trial favors thrombectomy for intermediate risk PEs, but not highly. Not enough to actually make this routine. I have my reservations, and I would like to see their follow-up publications, but I'd also like to see other studies of this with, more important outcomes. All right, and that's all the articles from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up of everything we talked about today. Then from the third article, Delirium is deadly. This paper really supports that. There's a very high morbidity and bounce back rate for patients in the emergency department who are discharged with delirium. And then from the fifth article, this is a point for thrombectomy, but not a very strong one. There is so much more I wish this trial could have done to make this a stronger trial. But all the same, it's nice to see some actual research comparing thrombectomy to usual care. Now, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were those articles that you missed about? One was about machine learning and predicting sepsis in pediatrics. Another was a comparison of all your options for lower GI bleed or risk stratification tools. And then finally, we looked at how much benefit really are high sensitivity troponins. Now, links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding. Thank you.